When most people think of Henry VIII, they remember the 6 wives, the break from the Catholic Church, and the glittering image of a Renaissance king. But by the end of his life, Henry had become something closer to a horror story than a royal legend. His body, once strong and athletic, had turned into a decaying prison that shocked everyone around him. The truth about his final years reveals a king whose very existence terrified even his closest servants. Henry's waistline measured 54 inches, wider than the height of many of his subjects. He weighed nearly 400 pounds at a time, when the average Englishman weighed less than half that. But it was not simply his size that horrified people. His legs were covered in enormous, festering ulcers that never healed. These were not minor sores, but open wounds that oozed pus and decaying flesh. The stench was so strong that courtiers sometimes gagged before they even entered his chamber. Servants dreaded being assigned to dress him, often drawing straws to decide who would be forced to approach the infected king. The grotesque physical decline was matched by the mystery of his mind. In 1536, Henry suffered a terrible accident in a joust. Thrown from his horse, he was knocked unconscious for 2 hours. Today, doctors would call it traumatic brain injury, and historians believe it marked a turning point. The young king, once known for charm and energy, began showing wild mood swings, bursts of rage, and relentless paranoia. Modern scholars suspect he also suffered from a hormonal disorder such as Cushing's syndrome, which explained his swelling body, unhealed wounds, and violent temper. But no one dared tell him the truth. To suggest that the king was ill could be considered treason. His doctors treated him carefully, offering remedies but never questioning his condition. The man who claimed divine right to rule could not even control his own body. By his last years, he needed mechanical devices to lift him, and special chairs were carried everywhere in case he collapsed. His attendants even managed his private needs, for Henry had lost control over the most basic functions. This was the monarch who executed nobles for looking at him the wrong way, who terrified Europe with his power. Yet behind the palace walls, he was a man crumbling from within. His body betrayed him as surely as he betrayed so many others. And as his health declined, so too did his grip on reality. What happened to his wives during these years was even darker, and their suffering reveals just how dangerous it was to live in Henry VIII's shadow. The story of Henry VIII's 6 wives is often simplified into a grim rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that little phrase hides the true depth of cruelty, manipulation, and fear these women endured. Living with Henry in his later years was not simply about facing the threat of execution. It was a daily battle of psychological torment. And Boleyn's fate is well known, but the details are chilling. Henry did not simply order her death. He arranged an elaborate scheme to destroy her reputation first. Under torture, her own musician was forced to confess to a false affair. Worse still, Henry accused her of betraying him with 5 men, including her own brother, and had to watch these men executed, knowing she was next. The entire trial was a fabrication, built to satisfy Henry's paranoia and his desire for a new wife. When she finally faced the sword, it was not just her life that had been destroyed, but her dignity. Catherine Howard's story was even more tragic. She was only a teenager when Henry, already bloated and ill, chose her as his bride. When rumors of her earlier relationship surfaced, Henry's response was not simply anger. He changed the law itself. A new statute declared it treason for anyone to marry the king without confessing their past. Catherine's youth offered no protection. She was executed at 19, her life taken not for betrayal, but for the impossible crime of having lived before Henry. Even those who avoided execution lived in terror. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, spent her last years separated from her daughter Mary, confined and humiliated. She wrote letters begging Henry for mercy, letters he ignored. She died alone, many suspecting poison. Anne of Cleves fared better, but only because she surrendered completely. Terrified after seeing what happened to her predecessors, she agreed to an annulment that declared their marriage had never been real. She even thanked Henry for sparing her life, a reminder of how powerless even a queen could be. Jane Seymour is often called a fortunate one, for she gave Henry his long-awaited son. Yet she paid with her life, dying from complications of childbirth. Henry wasted little time mourning her, beginning plans for his next marriage only days after her funeral. For him, wives were not partners. They were tools to be used, discarded, or destroyed according to his desires. What unites all 6 women is the absence of choice. Divorce was not an option. Escape was impossible. Resistance risked not only their lives, but also the lives of their families. Their suffering was more than political tragedy. It was the personal toll of a king whose body and mind were collapsing, but whose power allowed him to destroy anyone near him. And yet, Henry's cruelty was not limited to the women he married. His gluttony and obsessions were legendary, and his eating habits alone reveal a man consumed by excess, convinced that his royal status placed him above the very laws of nature. Henry VIII's appetite was as infamous as his temper. By the end of his reign, his meals had become spectacles, a twisted performance of wealth and paranoia. He consumed nearly 5,000 calories every day, more than double the needs of a strong soldier, even as his body was collapsing under the weight of disease and obesity. A typical meal was staggering. Entire roasted pigs, whole chickens, mountains of bread, multiple kinds of fish, and oceans of wine. His kitchens prepared over 800 dishes each day, employing more than 200 staff members to satisfy the king's desires. But it was not just a scale that shocked observers. It was the ritual. Every bite of food that touched his lips was first tested by multiple servants. Then, Henry forced him to wait for half an hour before he ate, just in case a delayed poison revealed itself. Meals often lasted 4 hours, with courtiers forced to watch their king gorge himself while pretending this grotesque display was normal. Henry's obsession with food extended into superstition. He believed that eating swan made him more graceful, venison improved his hunting, and oysters enhanced his strength with his wives. He banned ordinary foods like turnips and barley from his court, considering them beneath his royal dignity. Even though they might have saved his health, his body was breaking apart, covered in ulcers and swelling with disease, yet he continued to eat as if immune to consequence. Paranoia shaped every aspect of his life. He did not merely distrust his enemies. He feared everyone, even his children. He slept with loaded crossbows beside his bed and daggers under his pillow. Guards stood inside his chambers, watching him sleep. His palaces were riddled with secret passages and spy holes, so he could flee or spy on his courtiers. He built a network of informants to watch not only his nobles, but also each other, creating a world where no one knew whom to trust. Even the act of eating became a military operation. Guards supervised the kitchens. Salt, spices, and even water were tested for poison. Entire rooms were sealed during preparation. His daughters Mary and Elizabeth were watched by spies, treated as possible traitors in their own father's home. The Tower of London filled with prisoners whose only crime was attracting Henry's suspicion. In some cases, men and women were executed not for deeds, but for crimes Henry dreamed they might one day commit. This was not the life of a confident monarch. It was a nightmare of a man trapped in a decaying body, consumed by fear that everyone around him sought his death. And when death finally came, it did not bring peace. Instead, Henry's corpse would cause chaos on a scale that shocked even those accustomed to the horrors of his life. The harsh reality of war is that even among the so-called greatest generation, not every man lived up to the same code of honor. Both of the grandfathers described, one from the 101st Airborne Division and the other from the 28th Infantry Division, believed firmly in discipline and in maintaining civilized conduct even when surrounded by brutality. Their example, however, was not universally followed. Across the European theater, there were documented incidents of savagery, moments when soldiers, stripped of restraint by exhaustion, anger, or vengeance, carried out acts that violated both law and morality. But these men were not left unchecked. The U.S. Army, along with its allied partners, maintained military courts that prosecuted crimes committed by their own troops. The war was fought not only with weapons, but with principles that demanded soldiers answer for misconduct. Those who engaged in looting assaults, or worse, were often court-martialed. In some cases, punishments were severe. The armies understood that winning militarily was not enough. How they conducted themselves mattered to the long-term perception of the liberators in occupied lands. What is striking is how other soldiers regarded such behavior. According to memory passed down, men who crossed that line were not only punished legally, they were judged by their peers. They were shunned, despised, and treated with contempt because their actions dishonored the very uniform they wore. In many ways, that silent condemnation was as powerful as the courtroom sentences. To be branded as someone who broke the soldier's code was to carry a stain that no medal or victory could erase. The two grandfathers' insistence on civilized conduct reflected the deeper ethos of many veterans of World War II. They knew the world was watching. They knew that history would remember not just who won, but how they fought. In their view, leadership meant more than commanding men into battle. It meant guiding them to hold on to their humanity when everything around them tried to strip it away. That was what made their generation different. They lived through unspeakable destruction and loss, but still upheld standards that anchored them in something larger than themselves. Even decades later, those stories of discipline, of restraint, of holding the line not just against an enemy, but against one's own darker impulses, continue to stand as a reminder. The war was not just about tanks and planes, but about character. This is why their generation earned the name it still carries today. Not because every man was flawless, but because enough of them held fast to principles that set them apart. They proved that in war, true strength is not only measured in battles won, but in the ability to remain civilized when savagery was an easy option.